A stitched map, a missing heir, and a secret code only Miss Marple can decipher. Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I am your host, Liam. This mystery-loving community is growing. Leave a comment and share where you're tuning in from. I always look forward to your messages. They truly bring this journey to life. Let's begin. It was a mild September afternoon in the village of Tanswood Green, the kind of day when even the bees seemed drowsy with contentment, and the church bell rang not in alarm, but in time with the ticking of garden clocks. The harvest festival. Preparations were in full swing, with bunting going up along the lampposts, and the vicar's wife arguing with the organist about the appropriate length of the offertory hymn. In the front parlour of Honeysuckle Cottage, Miss Lavinia Croft, retired, schoolmistress and embroidery enthusiast, was hosting her regular Thursday needlework circle. The 7 women gathered there, ranging in age from youthful spinster to seasoned widow, worked in near silence broken only by the scratch of threads and the occasional clink of teacup against saucer. Miss Marple sat in her usual spot near the hearth, a small steady figure in dove grey, her fingers moving rhythmically over a pale linen square. Her design was modest, a sprig of foxglove outlined with quiet precision. But her eyes, though modestly cast downward, missed nothing. It was when Lavinia Croft rose to fetch another pot of tea that the disruption began. "Oh," said Lavinia, pausing at the bureau. "Now where on earth has it gone?" Mrs. Beryl Prout, who had been satin stitching a cushion cover with exaggerated zeal, looked up. "Something missing, dear?" "The map," said Lavinia, frowning. "That silly little map I embroidered for the church fundraiser, the one of the village with all the little cottages stitched in. I finished it last week and left it right here in the drawer. I was going to show you all today." "I remember that," said young Mabel Wren. "You said you were stitching the year into the corner in gold silk." "Yes," said Lavinia. "A very faint thread, but visible if you looked close. And I hid a little robin behind the east gate, just for fun." Miss Marple's needles paused for only the briefest second. "You're certain you left it there?" she asked softly. "Oh, yes," Lavinia replied. "Folded neatly with tissue, just next to my account book. I haven't touched the drawer since." "Tuesday," the women murmured amongst themselves, each offering a theory. Perhaps the vicar had borrowed it. Perhaps Lavinia had taken it to be framed and forgotten. But Lavinia was firm. It had been there, and now it was gone. "It's hardly valuable," she said. "Just a silly bit of village fluff. Still, it's strange." Miss Marple made a soft sound of assent, eyes still on her embroidery. Later that evening, as twilight dimmed the corners of Tanswood Green, Lavinia Croft went back into her parlour to search once more. She opened the drawer again, felt through the layers of tissue, checked beneath the account book. Nothing but something else caught her eye. A small envelope, not her own stationery. Inside was a folded sheet of heavy cream paper, unlined and marked with a curious smudge of blue wax. The letter was unsigned and contained a single sentence. "You shouldn't have stitched what wasn't meant to be seen." By the next morning, Lavinia Croft was dead. It was Mrs. Prout who found her, having returned the embroidery hoop she had borrowed the night before. The front door was unlocked, the parlour cold. The body of Lavinia Croft sat slumped in her armchair, her teacup broken at her feet. There were no signs of violence, no scent of poison, no evidence of struggle. Only the pale imprint of her embroidery frame still resting on her lap, and the faintest glint of gold thread caught between her fingers. The village reacted as only an English village can, with dismay, disbelief, and a flurry of whispered theories that moved faster than the morning milk round. Natural causes, said some. A heart condition, insisted others. But then came the talk of the missing map, the curious letter, and finally the whispered, chilling phrase from Mrs. Prout herself. She looked frightened. By the time Inspector Graves arrived from the next town over, the air was thick with conjecture and the scent of overbrewed tea. The inspector, a tidy man with a thin moustache and no patience for needlepoint, took statements, made polite assurances, and collected the teacup for analysis. He left with a notebook of vague impressions and a frown deepening with every conflicting account. He did not, however, speak at length with Miss Marple. That was his first mistake. For Miss Marple, having left Honeysuckle Cottage in measured steps, had already begun to see the shape of something not accidental. The map, the hidden robin, the letter with blue wax, all suggested something intentional, but not loud, not dramatic, something quiet, personal. In her experience, murder in a village was rarely about what people claimed. It was about what they feared would come to light, and nothing prompted more fear than something sown with care and revealing more than it should. That afternoon she sat by her garden wall, trimming her roses, while neighbours speculated from behind net curtains, and as she clipped the last of the season's blooms, her thoughts formed a question that would carry her through the days ahead. What had Miss Lavinia Croft known? What detail had she stitched by habit or whimsy that was not meant to be seen? And who in Tanswood Green had killed to ensure it never would? By Saturday morning, the grief in Tanswood Green had crystallized into tension. The news of Miss Lavinia Croft's sudden death had swept through the village with all the ceremony of a royal decree. Her passing, already unsettling due to its proximity to the mysterious disappearance of her embroidered village map, was now being discussed with a kind of cautious urgency. Neighbours mourned her, yes, but with questions flickering just behind their expressions. Miss Marple, having lived through more than one seemingly placid death that had revealed deep undercurrents, made her way to the small grocer's near the green with her shopping basket in hand and a list folded carefully in her glove. She moved without haste, her manner gentle, almost distracted. But her eyes were anything but unfocused. They missed nothing. Inside the shop, Mr. Penworthy, a plump and opinionated man with more opinions than shelves, was holding court as usual, behind the counter. Tragic, he was saying as Miss Marple stepped inside. Absolutely tragic. I told my wife only last month. Lavinia's face had gone thin. There was a look to her, hollow-eyed. I said, "That's a woman carrying something heavy." And sure enough, 2 weeks later, she drops dead in her chair. Mrs. Calder from the post office pursed her lips. "Do you think it was the fright of it all? The letter, I mean." "What letter?" asked Mr. Penworthy, his voice rising with interest. "Oh, haven't you heard?" she said, leaning closer, lowering her tone just enough to make it scandalous. "The housekeeper found it, no signature, no address, just a line warning her she shouldn't have stitched what wasn't meant to be seen." "Well, Mr. Penworthy," declared, nearly dropping a tin of sardines, "that doesn't sound like a natural death to me." Miss Marple, who had been studying a jar of orange marmalade as if it contained clues, spoke without turning. "Fear can be fatal," she said, gently. "The body often surrenders to what the mind cannot accept." The others turned to look at her. "You're not saying it was shock?" asked Mrs. Calder. "I'm saying," Miss Marple replied, selecting a smaller jar, "that sometimes what we call sudden is really only the culmination of what's been building quietly all along." She paid for her purchases, thanked Mr. Penworthy, and made her way back through the village square. As she passed the entrance to the churchyard, she paused. There, seated on the low wall near the iron gate, was Mabel Wren. Mabel was in her early 30s, though she carried herself with the nervous energy of someone still stuck between youth and spinsterhood. She had been among Lavinia's closest circle in the embroidery group, a former pupil of hers as well, and now worked part-time helping catalogue the parish archives. Her fingers fidgeted in her lap, as if still remembering the rhythm of thread through cloth. "Mabel, dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "I do hope you're not catching a chill." Mabel looked up quickly, startled. "Oh, Miss Marple, I don't quite know what I'm doing, really. I keep thinking of Miss Croft. It doesn't seem right, her being gone." Miss Marple sat beside her, the basket resting between them. "She was very fond of you," she said gently. Mabel smiled faintly. "She said I had neat hands. That's high praise from someone like her." "Did she ever speak to you about her map?" Miss Marple asked casually. "The embroidered one she made for the church auction." Mabel nodded quickly. "She worked on it every Thursday. She was very proud of it. Stitched each house with its proper number, even the old pump by the bakery. Said it was her little gift to the village history." "Do you recall her mentioning any changes she made? Anything unexpected?" Mabel's brow furrowed. "Only that she had added a robin behind the east gate. She said it was for luck, but she did seem distracted that last week. She asked me odd questions about the cottages, who lived where before the war, whether any addresses had changed." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Changed?" "Yes. She asked about number 17, Rosewood Cottage. She said she couldn't recall who lived there in 1937. I told her it was vacant until the Sally's family moved in. That seemed to surprise her." "Did she say why she was curious?" Mabel shook her head. "Only that she thought she'd spotted something strange when she compared her stitching to an old parish record." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, my dear. That's quite helpful." She rose and left Mabel behind, her thoughts churning now with greater direction. Rosewood Cottage. That was a quiet place set at the eastern edge of the village, where hedgerows grew thicker and the lanes narrowed. It had changed hands a few times, but for the past decade it had belonged to one Mr. Hector Bain, a reclusive man in his late 50s who kept bees, rarely attended village events, and whose past was a subject of vague speculation. His name had never caused much stir, but then again, neither had Lavinia Croft's embroidery. Until now Miss Marple decided to visit him. She arrived at Rosewood Cottage just past 4 o'clock. The garden was overgrown, though the hives in the back appeared meticulously maintained. The front gate creaked softly as she pushed it open. She knocked with quiet authority. Mr. Bain opened the door after some time, dressed in a waxed coat and gloves as though midway through tending his bees. "Miss Marple," he said, blinking, "to what do I owe the surprise?" "I'm so sorry to intrude," she said with a polite smile, "but I had some questions about village records. I thought you might be able to help." He hesitated. "I'm not much of a historian." "No," Miss Marple said softly, "but you do have a long memory, especially, I believe, about the year 1937. Bain's expression tightened, just slightly. "I was under the impression you only came to Tandswood in the late 1940s, Miss Marple continued. But according to the parish census, a Mr. H. Brackley rented Rosewood Cottage for 3 years in the late 30s. He worked for the ministry in London. Discreet work, I believe." Bain said nothing. "I only mention this," Miss Marple went on, "because Lavinia Croft was stitching from that very same record when she asked Mabel about the house, and it seems she noticed a detail that most had forgotten." "She didn't die because of a record," Bain said suddenly. His voice had a sharpness to it now. "She died because she wanted to turn a harmless past into a public curiosity." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "She was a woman of precision," she said, "and when she saw that something in her embroidery didn't match the records, she grew curious. A number, perhaps, a small change, or a symbol misplaced." Bain's jaw was tight. "She may have guessed," he said finally, "but she didn't know." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Didn't know what?" He said nothing. She nodded once. "Well," she said, "if she didn't know, then there was no need to threaten her, and certainly no need to frighten her to death." She turned and left the doorstep as quietly as she had arrived. By the time she reached the lane again, her suspicions were no longer soft. There had been something hidden in that embroidery, something stitched innocently but revealing, a secret buried in a pattern, a past hidden behind thread, and someone who knew it was being uncovered, had acted not out of panic, but premeditation, not a crime of passion, but a crime of preservation. By Sunday morning, the village of Tandswood Green was humming with nervous energy beneath its surface. On the face of it, all was as it should be. Children scrambled out of cottages, freshly scrubbed and squinting in the sunshine. Baskets of flowers lined the stone wall outside the church, and the bell, as always, rang out over the rooftops with reassuring rhythm. But something quieter rang underneath, a tension that moved between glances, across conversations, and especially in the silence that fell when the name Lavinia Croft was mentioned. Miss Marple arrived at St Aidan's just before the second bell. She settled herself into her customary pew near the rear, her hands folded demurely over her handbag. From her seat, she could see nearly everyone. The Harkness boys fidgeting behind their mother, Mrs. Calder whispering with the organist, and in the far corner, a familiar figure seated alone. Mr. Hector Bain. He had never been a regular churchgoer. That morning, however, he seemed to sit with unusual posture, eyes forward, lips unmoving, as if he were not attending service so much as waiting for it to end. Miss Marple studied him without staring, her gaze flickering between the hymnals and the stained-glass window above the chancel. Something had shifted in Mr. Bain since their conversation the previous afternoon. He had not reacted like a man suddenly cornered. He had reacted like someone who had rehearsed a defense, but still feared that the past might stir into focus at the wrong moment. After the service, the congregation spilled into the churchyard like marbles loosed from a bag. Children played among the gravestones while the adults loitered in polite clusters. Miss Marple found herself approached by Reverend Edmund Felton, a tall, earnest man with thinning hair and an irrepressible fondness for sermons that ran 10 minutes. "Too long, Miss Marple," he said, shaking her hand warmly. "You're looking remarkably well. I do hope you're managing in all this unfortunate confusion." "I manage best when the truth is near," she said with a slight smile. "Tell me, Reverend, Have you had any reason to examine the church records recently? The old property rolls, for instance." He blinked. "Why, yes, Miss Wren's been helping me sort through them these past weeks. We're preparing a display for the Harvest Festival, Tanzwood Through the Decades." "Quite a lovely little project." "Did Miss Croft ever see them?" asked Miss Marple. "Indeed she did. She consulted them briefly to compare addresses for her embroidery. I believe she wanted to ensure historical accuracy. She was very particular about such things." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Particularity was her gift, and it may be what cost her." The Reverend's brow furrowed. "You believe there's more to her death?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that if someone hides a truth long enough they may forget the shape of it, but all it takes is a sharp enough eye and a needle in the right place for it to reappear." She thanked him and moved away before he could press her further. As she stepped onto the gravel path that led from the church, she was joined by Mabel Wren. "I saw you speaking with Reverend Felton," Mabel said shyly. "I hope he didn't bore you with talk of the archives. He does get quite excited about old maps and church deeds." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "In fact, it reminded me of something I'd been meaning to ask you." "Oh?" "That embroidery map, before it went missing, did Lavinia ever mention why she added that robin behind the east gate?" Mabel tilted her head. "Only that it was for luck, but she said it had been inspired by something in the records, something to do with a symbol. I didn't press her. She always liked to be a little mysterious about her designs." "A symbol?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "What sort of symbol?" "I don't know," Mabel said apologetically. "Only that she said it wasn't really meant to be seen. Just a mark in the records like an initial or a little flourish beside the cottage listing." Miss Marple nodded. Her mind had already leapt ahead. That afternoon, with the village grown quiet under the warmth of early autumn, she returned to her cottage and opened the oak chest in her parlour, where she kept her own stitchwork and a few of Lavinia Croft's early samplers. Lavinia had, over the years, gifted Miss Marple several pieces, mostly modest bookmarks or herb sachets, but once, nearly a decade ago, she had given her a hand-stitched runner adorned with stylized cottages. Miss Marple retrieved it now and studied it carefully beneath the good light of her window. There, behind a stitched hedge near the margin, was the same robin design, just a few soft red and brown threads, half hidden by green leaves. It wasn't part of the main pattern. It had been tucked in as a signature of sorts, but the placement on that piece, as in the missing map, was consistent. The robin wasn't just a flourish, it was a marker. Miss Marple consulted a copy of the village layout, one of the early surveyors. Maps tucked into the back pages of her local almanac. She compared the location of the robin with the corresponding site in the village, the eastern boundary, just past Rosewood Cottage. There had once been an outbuilding there, not a cottage, but a shed of sorts, long since removed, though still noted in the older maps. According to a faded entry, it had been requisitioned by the Ministry of Information in 1938 during the war preparation efforts, unmarked, coded, and then erased. Miss Marple rose from her chair and fetched her shawl. The weather was still fair. There was one more person she needed to speak to. That evening she paid a visit to Mrs. Elsie Marwood, one of the oldest residents of Tanzwood Green, who now lived in the almshouse cottage by the brook. Elsie had been Lavinia's closest friend in their youth, and was known for remembering everything, even when she wasn't supposed to. Over a cup of barley tea and a small plate of ginger snaps, Miss Marple steered the conversation gently. "Do. You recall," she asked, "when that shed stood near Rosewood Cottage? I believe it was taken down just after the war." Elsie narrowed her eyes thoughtfully. "Oh, yes," she said. "They never said much about it. Belonged to the government, we were told. Rumour had it that they stored maps in there. The fancy kind. Not the sort anyone was meant to see." "Maps?" Elsie nodded. "My brother said one of the men who worked there used to arrive in a lorry with special plates. Quiet sort. Always wore gloves. Harold something. Not Galbraith. No, Brackley. That's it. Harold Brackley." Miss Marple's heart gave a subtle internal nod. Brackley was Bain. Of that she was now sure. She thanked Elsie and made her way home as the stars began to prick the sky. Her thoughts spun like spools of thread, unravelling and winding again. She'd had hidden documents. Bain, or Brackley, had been involved in something sensitive, something left unspoken for decades. Lavinia unknowingly had stitched the location into her map, referencing a symbol found in old parish rolls, perhaps a notation marking the outbuilding, and Bain had recognized it, had panicked, had written the letter, and someone, Bain or another, had ensured she would never stitch again. Miss Marple lit her reading lamp and pulled her notepad close. There was more to uncover. The pattern was emerging, faint but distinct, and soon, like all secrets poorly hidden, the truth would be drawn out, thread by careful thread. Monday arrived with a thin fog curling over the rooftops, giving the stone chimneys of Tanswood Green the look of old men exhaling after a troubled sleep. The sky held a soft pewter tint that seemed to hush the village. Though the shops opened as usual and the post was delivered without delay, there was a subdued quality to the day's rhythm. Something unsaid had begun to take root. Miss Marple, ever observant of such subtle shifts, noted the quiet as she made her way through the village square. She stopped at the milliner's to return a hatpin, paused at the library to exchange a borrowed gardening guide, and then made her way along the lane to Rosewood Cottage, not to knock, but to look. She lingered at the corner where the old boundary hedgerow met the slope that once led to the shed mentioned in the old records. The ground bore no evidence of what had once stood there, only a patch of earth that stayed oddly dry even after rain. She knew from long experience that secrets had a way of pressing upward through the soil, no matter how deep one tried to bury them. Later that morning, she returned to Honeysuckle Cottage, Lavinia Croft's former home. It had been sealed briefly by the local constable for the usual cursory inspection, and then left untouched. Miss Croft, after all, had not died violently, not obviously, but Miss Marple had spoken with the vicar and obtained, with appropriate delicacy, permission to retrieve a personal sampler of Lavinia's that had been promised as a raffle item for the harvest festival. She arrived alone, armed with gloves, a small notebook, and the quiet certainty that the drawing-room would still hold echoes. The parlour was still. Afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains, falling in lattices across the armchair where Lavinia had died. Miss Marple stood silently for a moment before approaching the embroidery chest by the window. Inside were neatly folded samplers arranged by size and motif. She carefully sifted through them, noting the orderliness of the drawer. Lavinia had always worked with a schoolteacher's precision, But then near the bottom, something curious. One of the samplers, an older piece in pale linen stitched with an elaborate border of leaves and birds, had a faint, irregular stain in the upper right corner. Not wine or tea, something duller. She held it up to the light. Ink, perhaps. Or more. Precisely dried wax, blue wax, the same shade Jenny Bletchley had described on the letter found beside Lavinia after her death. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. This sampler had not been sealed away for years. The wax was only faintly set into the fibres, not yet faded by time or exposure. It must have come into contact with the letter recently. Perhaps Lavinia had placed it on her lap while reading. Perhaps she had connected the symbol from the old parish records with something she'd once stitched. An old motif she had forgotten held greater meaning. Carefully, Miss Marple folded the piece and placed it into a separate envelope she had brought for the purpose. She stood again in the centre of the parlour, eyes moving slowly around the room. A stack of books on the writing desk, a sewing basket with 2 unused needles, and atop the mantel, something that had no business being there, a small hand-painted tile with a pattern of geometric diamonds, Spanish or perhaps North African, not Lavinia's usual taste. Miss Marple lifted it. There was nothing on the underside, but the pattern, the central star framed by alternating blue and green shapes, was unmistakably a cipher of some kind. She had seen similar motifs used in decorative military designs during the war, especially in code books that embedded information in what appeared to be mere art. She placed the tile back and stepped away. The pieces were beginning to converge. She made her way next to the village library, where she found Mabel Wren once again hunched over the parish display board, arranging black and white photographs of Tanneswood as it appeared in the 1920s. "Mabel, dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "I wonder if I might trouble you to help me find something, not in the records but among the embroidery circle's recent donations." Mabel looked up. "Of course, Miss Marple. We boxed everything up last Friday after tea. Most of it's stored in the vestry until the auction. Do you recall if Miss Croft submitted more than one item for the festival?" Mabel nodded slowly. "Yes, she did. The map, of course, but also 2 samplers. One of them was an old-school design she said she'd had tucked away for years. She only added it because she thought it might amuse someone nostalgic. Would you describe it as a leafy border with birds?" "Yes," Mabel replied, blinking. "That's the one. How did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because I've just held it in my hands." Mabel furrowed her brow. "Was it important?" "Only in the way small things sometimes are." Miss Marple thanked her, then walked once more to the constabulary, where Inspector Bramley sat at his desk, chewing his pencil in a manner that suggested more fatigue than frustration. He was a decent man, careful in paperwork but limited in imagination. She knew how to speak to him. "Inspector," she said as she entered, "I believe it's time you asked Mr. Hector Bain why he changed his name in 1946. Bramley sat up, startled. "Pardon?" "Bain is Brackley," she continued, "formerly of the ministry. He worked in intelligence during the war, stationed briefly here in Tanneswood, at a facility behind what is now his cottage. I believe Miss Croft, entirely by accident, reintroduced an old symbol in her embroidery, the kind used in wartime map coding, something that was meant to remain buried. Mr. Bain recognized it and panicked. Bramley frowned. But why would she reproduce that symbol now? Because it was a design she had stitched once before, said Miss Marple. Years ago. She likely copied it from a note or pamphlet without understanding its nature. But in revisiting old motifs for her map, she unwittingly revealed something. She'd forgotten, something he could not afford to be noticed. Bramley looked uncertain. And the letter? I believe Mr. Bain sent it to frighten her, Miss Marple said. Not to harm, but to silence. But Lavinia was not one to be bullied, and when she refused to be shaken, he, or someone else, ensured she wouldn't speak further. There are poisons that don't leave obvious traces, Inspector. Digitalis, for example, or belladonna when introduced in low doses to someone already prone to heart trouble. Bramley stood slowly. You believe she was poisoned? I believe, Miss Marple said softly, that the fear alone did not kill her, but something helped it along. She left him standing there, his pen forgotten, the investigation already beginning to reconfigure in his mind. Outside, the sky had cleared slightly, the first hints of blue breaking through the mist. Miss Marple returned home, removed her gloves and sat down by the window to finish her foxglove embroidery. The colours gleamed faintly in the afternoon light. The plant, after all, was beautiful and terribly, terribly poisonous. Tuesday dawned with a surprising burst of clarity. No fog, no drizzle, only a crisp golden light that streamed through the hedgerows and dappled the cobblestones like spilt honey. The villagers of Tanswood Green seemed to move with cautious optimism, as if the week's earlier unease had been packed away like winter linen. But Miss Marple, whose instincts remained immune to the weather, knew that sunlight could often disguise shadow. And shadow, in her long experience, always clung to the edges of secrets. She spent the early part of the morning pruning her rose arbour, a quiet activity that allowed her thoughts to nest and take form. The sampler with the wax stain now sat folded in a linen envelope beside her writing table, and the Spanish tile with the cipher-like motif lingered in her memory like a piece of music not quite resolved. But it was not to the embroidery that her attention turned that day. It was to the money. In her experience, death had two great motivators, love and fear. But the mechanism of silence was often greased with money. If Mr. Bain, formerly Brackley, had sought to disappear after the war, he would have needed assistance, and more than that, he would have needed discretion. After a light breakfast, Miss Marple tied her scarf, selected her softest gloves, and made her way toward the one place in Tanswood where secrets were entered in ink: the village solicitor's office. The office of G.H. Longmire & Co. was tucked into a converted coach-house beside the chemist, its low-beamed interior and dark oak shelves lending it the sort of gravitas that made even the most modest will feel significant. Inside, behind a desk littered with small ink blotters and brass clips, sat Mr. Percy Longmire, the solicitor's nephew and current operator of the family business. "Miss Marple," he said, rising politely. "What a pleasure. Are you in need of assistance? You're not drafting a new will, I hope?" She smiled gently. "Not today, Mr. Longmire. I wondered rather if I might inquire about a specific transaction, purely historical, I assure you, relating to the property at Rosewood Cottage." He raised a brow. "Historical. Post-war," she said, "circa 1946. The name associated with the deed at the time was Brackley, I believe, but I'm told it now belongs to Mr. Bain." Longmire blinked slowly. That's curious. Is it indeed? Well, he said, leafing through a stack of property records beside him, Bain's name is on the most recent deed, yes. But the original post-war purchase from the Ministry's holding fund was signed by one Harold Brackley. Same handwriting, from the look of it. But no formal transfer ever took place. There's no legal record of a name change, no re-registration. With the land registry under Bain's name, no inheritance, none listed, which would suggest either he fabricated an identity or someone chose not to notice. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. And the funds, do? They show a mortgage or outside lender. Longmire shook his head. No, full purchase, paid in cash. Cash, she repeated. That's quite a thing just after the war. Indeed, he said. Most people were scraping for every ration coupon. Tell me, Mr. Longmire, she continued, if someone wished to hide a name and had the means, what would prevent discovery? He considered her question for a moment. In a small village, very little, except, perhaps, apathy. Or a gentleman's agreement. People don't often go digging into things they're told are best left alone. She nodded, stood, and thanked him. As she walked back through the village, Miss Marple considered what she had learned. Bain, Brackley, had maintained his new life not by deception alone, but by collective silence. Someone had helped him, or at least chosen not to interfere. But who? She found herself passing the home of Mrs. Clara Winchcombe, formerly secretary to the late parish council clerk, and more importantly, the keeper of all manner of paperwork that never made it into official files. Clara was not the sort to trust. Machines. She still wrote her lists in fountain pen and kept carbon copies of everything. Miss Marple admired her for that. She was invited in for tea, and after 2 sips of a very tart elderflower cordial, Miss Marple asked her question. Did you, by any chance, ever process or file documents related to the Ministry's wartime holdings, particularly the parcel behind Rosewood Cottage? Clara adjusted her spectacles. Oh, I shouldn't think I did it formally. The war records were sorted by the London office. But I did take notes when the last inventory was made. 1946, that would have been. I still have the ledger somewhere. Stood and shuffled to the tall sideboard in the corner of the room, returning moments later with a thick notebook wrapped in a tea towel. She opened it on the table and ran her finger down a page. Here. It says, Parcel 17A, storage cleared. Ministry personnel withdrawn. No official transfer recorded. Notes, to be entered in village record as disused. Miss Marple leaned closer. See this, Clara said, tapping the margin. A tiny mark, crossed needles. I always used that symbol for embroidery requests, usually. Meant someone needed cloth or canvas from the same parcel. And who added it? Clara frowned. Not me, that's Lavinia Croft's handwriting. A silence stretched between them. Miss Marple felt a quiet click inside her thoughts. Lavinia had seen the same ledger. She had found the symbol, her own, from years earlier. Had likely been the one to request old cloth from the Ministry's storeroom, perhaps for school use. She had stitched the pattern, kept the motif, and decades later, unwittingly used it again. Miss Marple left shortly after, her mind now knitting together strands that had been scattered. The sampler had been older than, it seemed, the ciphered motif stitched not from imagination but from memory, and Lavinia had rediscovered, just weeks before her death, the very pattern that linked her to a man desperate to remain hidden. That evening, Miss Marple sat beside her hearth with her notebook open. She reviewed her observations. The embroidered map had vanished. A wax-stained sampler had resurfaced. A wartime ministry agent had adopted a new name and identity. Lavinia had unknowingly reproduced a classified symbol from a coded map series, and someone, somewhere, had feared what else she might remember. And then there was the tile. Decorative, yes, but possibly something more. Miss Marple fetched it from where she had asked Mabel to place it for safekeeping. She held it to the firelight. The colours, blue, green and gold, seemed arbitrary until she rotated it slightly. Then, as with some optical illusions, a new pattern emerged, not geometric but alphabetical. The blue diamonds, when traced in a specific order, formed the letters H.B. Harold Brackley, his mark. Hidden in the tile, just as it had once been hidden in a stitched border. Miss Marple sat back, her expression unreadable. She now knew who had sent the letter. She suspected who had stolen the map. But the question remained. Had Mr. Bain been the only one who feared exposure? Or had someone else, someone closer to Lavinia than Brackley ever was, realized that her stitchwork might reveal more than even she knew? In silence, Miss Marple reached for her teacup. The code was unraveling. But the true motive still waited, tucked perhaps in a drawer behind a smile, or in the eyes of someone who'd admired Lavinia's stitching, not for its beauty, but for the danger it held. The following day brought a sudden shift in the weather. A crisp wind rattled the window panes of Tanswood Green, shaking the first gold-edged leaves loose from the horse-chestnuts. Summer's last breath had gone, and the quiet sting of approaching autumn settled over the village like a shawl. Inside, fires were lit earlier, doors creaked more frequently, and thoughts turned inward. Miss Marple, however, was not one to rest, when a mystery had begun to unspool. She had spent the night reviewing her notes, the sampler, and the ornate tile with its layered geometry. Every symbol, every mark, every phrase spoke not just of secrecy, but of control, deliberate, methodical control. This had not been a crime of panic. No, this was far older and more carefully rooted. She now believed the map, Lavinia's embroidered village map, made for the harvest festival, had not been taken by the man known as Hector Bain. If anything, Bain had panicked only when he recognized what it might reveal. But he had not acted with enough speed or cunning to have orchestrated its disappearance or Lavinia's death alone. Someone else had moved first, and that someone was far more comfortable with silence. Miss Marple tucked a folded scarf into her handbag, slipped on her grey wool coat, and set out for the village hall where preparations for the postponed harvest festival were back underway. The committee had decided unanimously that a show of normalcy was in order. Inside, bunting was being rehung, and folding tables were being arranged to display preserves, pastries, and needlework. Miss Price, who chaired the decorating committee, with a mixture of zeal and despair, was instructing a young boy to balance a ladder beside the window sash. Mabel Wren, head down at the textiles table, was unfolding each submission with the care of a museum curator. Miss Marple approached softly. "Anything missing?" she asked in a warm voice. Mabel looked up, startled. "Oh, Miss Marple. No, nothing's gone astray, thank goodness, but—" She hesitated. "But Mabel lowered her voice and glanced around. "I don't think Miss Croft's map was the only item tampered with," she whispered. "I was just unpacking the altar cloth she donated to the church last year. We'd stored it folded in tissue since Easter. And now the corner panel, the one she embellished herself, it's been unpicked." Miss Marple blinked. "Unpicked?" "Yes. Delicately. Just the lower right square. The stitches are gone, but the indentations in the fabric are still visible. Like someone removed it but recently. The thread was deep gold, very fine, the same color she used in the map." Miss Marple took a slow breath. "A repeated motif. The robin, perhaps. Or something else. Hidden, not in plain sight, but in repetition. Hidden, because it had once been used not as decoration, but as a marker." She stepped closer to the altar cloth. Mabel lifted it with both hands and unfolded it across the table. The cloth was creamy linen, starched to hold its shape. In each corner, Lavinia had embroidered a slightly different symbol, a stylized gate, a vine of ivy, a cluster of rowan berries. But in the bottom right corner, the fabric was bare, with faint punctures just visible in the light. Miss Marple leaned in. A straight line of pin pricks ran diagonally, then bent at a right angle and continued downward, ending in a small loop. She had seen that shape before. It was the tail of a bird. A robin if stitched, a compass marker if read differently. "May I borrow this?" Miss Marple asked. Mabel nodded, watching her with wide eyes. "I'll return it by tomorrow. And Mabel," she added quietly, "do not mention this to anyone. Not even Miss Price." "Of course," said Mabel, clearly nervous. "Is it dangerous?" Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. "No, my dear, but it is delicate." She took the cloth, wrapped it neatly in brown paper, and returned home. At her kitchen table, she unfolded it again and traced the pattern against the light. It was not merely decorative, it was directional. The bird motif, used in 3 of Lavinia's past designs, was consistent in angle. In the 4th, now missing, it had shifted. It pointed north, straight through the eastern boundary of Rosewood Cottage and toward the old site of the ministry outpost. Someone had noticed. Someone had known. Not Bain. Bain had recognized the pattern, certainly, but not its context. Miss Marple returned to her armchair with a cup of nettle tea and her notebook. There was a time in England, she knew, when maps were encoded not with symbols, but with textiles. Fabric maps, stitched by civilians under wartime orders, were used to guide agents. Lightweight, quiet, untraceable. Lavinia, as a young schoolmistress, may have assisted in such efforts unknowingly. But what if one of her pieces, saved, reused, unremembered, contained more than she knew? What if someone else knew it too? That afternoon she paid a visit to someone she had been saving, Mrs. Rosemary Fell. Rosemary was not a local by birth, but had lived in Tanswood for 20 years. Sharp-featured, with the kind of smile that always seemed a little too quick, she had served on every committee the village had to offer, and was known for her quiet advice when things became too difficult for others to handle. She also happened to be Lavinia Croft's executor. "Miss Marple," Rosemary said as she ushered her in, "what a surprise. Do come in. The hallway's frightfully cold this week. Our pipes rattle when the wind blows from the north." "How inconvenient," Miss Marple murmured, stepping through the door. "I imagine the wind can stir up all sorts of things." Rosemary's sitting room was as spotless as ever. Her tea service was already laid out, and she poured with practiced ease. "I'm glad someone's still showing good sense," she said, handing over a cup. "All this fuss over poor Lavinia's death. Tragic, yes, but hardly scandalous." "Quite agree," said Miss Marple mildly. "But there's something I've been wondering about. As executor, were you the one to open her embroidery chest?" Rosemary paused, just long enough to answer the question without words. "I did inspect it briefly," she said, "only to ensure nothing valuable had gone missing. There was a lot of confusion at first." "Was there?" Miss Marple sipped her tea. "It seemed to me things were quite orderly, except, of course, for the map." Rosemary blinked. "Yes, a real shame. She'd put so much into it." Miss Marple set down her cup. "And the tile? The tile. The small ceramic square, with the diamond motif, painted, not Lavinia's style, if I may say so." Rosemary's lips thinned. "Oh, that. I believe it was a gift. Perhaps from Hector Bain." "Perhaps," Miss Marple echoed, "though it may have come from the same place as the motif Lavinia used in the corner of the altar cloth, the missing corner." Rosemary rose abruptly. "I'm afraid I've just remembered. I've left my stew on the hob." Miss Marple stood, Haswell gathering her gloves. "Of course, one must be careful with heat. It has a way of bringing everything to the surface." She left before Rosemary could reply. The evening settled over the village with a heavy quiet. But in her own parlour, Miss Marple was wide awake. Rosemary Fell had not panicked, but she had flinched. She had known about the tile. She had seen the corner missing from the cloth. She had, perhaps, seen more of Lavinia's needlework over the years than anyone else in the village. And if Lavinia had stumbled across something she was never meant to remember, it was Rosemary, not Bain, who had the access, the motive, and the calm necessary to intervene. Not to lash out, but to silence. The weather held steady through Wednesday, grey and brisk, with clouds huddled low like gossiping housewives over the thatched roofs of Tanswood Green. In the narrow alleys behind green iron gates and ivy-covered fences, the mood of the village had turned, no longer merely uneasy, but taut. People lowered their voices, lingered behind curtains, and walked with the sense that something unseen was brushing just behind them. Miss Marple, for her part, had moved with calm precision. She had visited the parish archives early that morning, requesting innocuous old festival leaflets and last year's harvest program as a pretext. But what she truly examined was the donation ledger, carefully handwritten by Lavinia Croft herself, and a page marked "Anonymous Gift, Altered Map." Frame, value unlisted. It was dated 4 days before her death. The map, framed, altered. The frame, not the stitches. Miss Marple sat back and thought about what that might mean. If Lavinia had reframed the map, it would explain why no one had seen it prior to the gathering. And if someone else had interfered with the backing, added or removed something, it could explain the motive. A code, concealed not in the thread, but behind the cloth. A message meant to stay hidden. And Lavinia, curious or perhaps merely meticulous, had found it. That afternoon Miss Marple returned to Rosewood Cottage. She had requested to speak again with Hector Bain, or rather, the man once known as Harold Brackley, and to her surprise, he had agreed. The previous visit had left him anxious, agitated, and vague, but this time he was calm, a little too calm. He stood at the threshold, eyes sunken and rimmed with red, and gestured for her to come inside. The parlour was dark, the fire unlit, but the air still carried the faint scent of polish and lavender sachets. A blue woolen blanket lay over the armchair where Lavinia used to sit. On the mantel, her embroidery hoop had been placed neatly beside a ceramic trinket box. "I appreciate your time," Miss Marple said gently. He nodded but did not speak. She sat down across from him, notepad tucked beside her. "There's something I must ask you, Mr. Bain, and I ask it not as an accusation but as an observation. When you saw the embroidery map that day, what was it that startled you?" He stared at the floor for a moment. Then he sighed. "It wasn't the stitches," he said at last. "Not directly, it was the outline. The pattern she used for the road winding through the woods. It looked like something I'd seen before, on an old ministry blueprint. A classified drop. Point, I thought it was coincidence, but then I recognized the robin." "The robin?" He nodded. 3 red dots, arranged in a triangle. That was the marker we used for a secure cache. During a mission, it meant the location was safe to pass a message or receive one. We embedded the marker into various local crafts, signage, tiles, even church mosaics. And you saw it in Lavinia's work?" "Yes, and more than once. She used it in the corner of her sampler, too, years ago. I'd dismissed it back then, thought it harmless, but when she placed it again, on the map and on the altar cloth, you grew uneasy." Bain swallowed hard. "Yes, but I swear I didn't kill her." "I believe you," said Miss Marple. She let a moment pass, listening to the stillness in the room. Then she leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about Rosemary Fell." Bain's expression changed. "She was one of the liaison clerks during my ministry work," he said. "Transferred here after the war. We kept in touch for a few years. Then she moved to Tanswood and stayed." "Why?" "She was Lavinia's executor," Miss Marple said softly. "She had access to her papers, to her needlework, to her habits, and I believe she knew more than she ever admitted, including the significance of what Lavinia had stitched, because she helped design it." Bain looked stricken. "No, Rosemary. She was harmless." Miss Marple gave a gentle shrug. "Some of the most dangerous people are those who appear harmless." She thanked him, then left him with his ghosts. That evening, a small gathering was held at the vicarage, a quiet supper to reassure the village and remind them that life, however shaken, must go on. The vicar and his wife had made every effort to provide warmth and comfort. Tea was poured from a silver pot, scones passed politely, and the fire roared with more enthusiasm than the conversation. Miss Marple, seated near the bay window, listened with gentle attentiveness as villagers speculated about the tragedy. "I do think it must have been natural causes," murmured Mrs. Prout to her right. "Poor Lavinia was always a bit high-strung." Miss Price disagreed. No. She looked far too composed to have died of fright. I rather suspect poison, something subtle, foxglove perhaps." The vicar coughed. "Let's not speculate." Miss Marple smiled to herself. She excused herself to the kitchen to fetch a second cup of tea, and found Rosemary Fell there alone, wiping down the counter. "My dear," said Miss Marple with a pleasant tone, "you've done so much for the parish. It can't be easy stepping in to organize things after such unexpected sadness." Rosemary gave a tight smile. "Well, someone has to." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did you ever consider what Lavinia might have uncovered when she chose to reframe that map?" Rosemary froze just briefly. "I assumed it was artistic." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "but Lavinia wasn't frivolous. She was precise and—" When she used golden thread in the corner, she was referencing a marker. "You and I both know it." A pause. "You helped encode materials for the ministry, didn't you?" Rosemary set the cloth down slowly. "I was a junior assistant," she said. "I typed documents, reviewed civilian contributions, but I wasn't involved in operations." "No," said Miss Marple quietly, "but you knew what the codes meant, and when you saw Lavinia's embroidery match one of them, when you realized she had replicated a forgotten message, you acted." "Miss Marple," said Rosemary coldly, "you're indulging in fantasy." "Possibly," said Miss Marple, unruffled, "but I should tell you before you do anything hasty that the sampler with the marker still exists, and I've taken the liberty of showing it to Inspector Graves." Now there was real panic in Rosemary's eyes, and, Miss Marple continued, "I made a copy of Lavinia's donation ledger. The entry for the altered map frame is quite enlightening. It appears Lavinia was curious about something placed behind the cloth, something she didn't put there. But perhaps you did." A beat of silence stretched. Then Rosemary's voice, very low. "She said she'd hand it over, that she would let the vicar see it. I couldn't let that happen." Miss Marple nodded sadly. "She wasn't trying to expose anyone," she said, "but in tracing her memories she unknowingly touched something forgotten by all but a few." "She was always too clever," Rosemary whispered. "Too neat, too exact. I thought she might unstop. But when she framed that map, I knew." Miss Marple reached out gently, placing her gloved hand on Rosemary's. "She never suspected you," she said. "Not truly." Rosemary said nothing. When Inspector Graves arrived 15 minutes later, summoned by a quiet telephone call, Miss Marple did not need to say much. The evidence would follow, but the truth had already been revealed by a stitch, a robin, and the careful silence of a woman who had hidden too long in plain sight. The next morning broke pale and listless over Tanswood Green, a mist clinging low over hedgerows and chimneys like a secret refusing to lift. News of Rosemary Fell's quiet removal by Inspector Graves had not yet reached the wider village. But as was often the case in close communities, the very air seemed to carry a hum of knowing. Curtains twitched with more frequency. Conversations started with unnatural brightness and ended abruptly. Even the postman lingered longer at each gate, half expecting someone to open a door and confess to something. At Honeysuckle Cottage, Miss Marple poured herself a small cup of hot water with lemon and honey. She sat at her window overlooking the garden, where the last of the marigolds bowed their heads to the coming chill. A pair of wrens darted between branches, far less conspiratorial than the humans nearby. She had slept little. Her mind had lingered, not on the guilt of Rosemary Fell now revealed and taken, but on what Rosemary had said in the still kitchen the evening before. She said she'd hand it over, that she would let the vicar see it. I couldn't let that happen. There had been something in that sentence, a precision not in the admission of guilt, but in the fear of exposure. It was not shame or regret that had motivated Rosemary's silence. It was something else. Something heavier. Miss Marple reached for her notebook. Lavinia had stumbled across something old, a hidden code, yes, but more than that, she had interpreted it, and her interpretation had frightened someone. Not because of what she'd remembered, but because of what she planned to do. She had wanted the vicar to see it. Why, the clue must lie in the church, then. Not just in its community, but in its records, its land, its very bones. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had made her way to St Mildred's, the modest parish church nestled beside the green. The gates were open, but the building was empty, save for the soft tap of the curate's steps echoing through the nave. He was a nervous young man named Mr. Aberley, known for his stammer and fondness for floral sermons. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said when he saw her. "To a lovely surprise. Were you looking for Reverend Hughes?" No, dear. I'm actually hoping to look through the vestry ledger, the one Lavinia Croft contributed to some years ago. She was, I believe, responsible for some entries involving donated items. Yes, of course," said Mr. Aberley. "Though, is this about what happened to her? People have been saying such things. I find," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that people say quite a lot. But the truth, Mr. Aberley usually prefers to whisper." He led her to the vestry, a stone chamber cool with age and the smell of candle wax. The ledgers were kept on a narrow shelf above the cupboard. He retrieved one marked 1946-1950. Miss Marple sat at a narrow oak table and opened the book. She read carefully, scanning names, donation types, and comments written in Lavinia's firm, neat hand. Hymnals, banners, a watercolour of St Mildred's steeple. Then, on the final page of the 1948 entries, one line caught her eye. Received from Monsieur Ashcroft, D.C.D., one embroidered map, record of civic rebuilding after war bomb damage. Note, includes coded legacy references. See enclosed. Miss Marple. Inhaled coded legacy references. Enclosed. She flipped the page. Taped there, now yellowed and curling, was a narrow strip of parchment in Lavinia's hand. It listed locations in the village, some familiar, others oddly phrased. Ash Tree Well, hidden plaque, C 1943 dedication. 2. East Gate Wall, birdmark present, verify under frame. 3. Vicar's Garden, buried token 2 feet from sundial. 4. Hall of Records, rear corridor tile, diamond-shaped. Miss Marple closed the book and stood. "Mr. Aberley," she said, "do you know anything about a man named M. Ashcroft?" He blinked. "Oh, yes. He was a churchwarden just after the war. Died in 1948, I think. He'd been with the ministry before that. Something to do with civic reconstruction. His brother owned the tailor shop by the green." "And did he leave anything behind to the church?" Mr. Aberley hesitated. "Some materials, yes, a few plaques, old wartime documents, but they're in storage. Reverend Hughes always said they were too dry for the Heritage Day display." Miss Marple smiled. "Would you mind terribly showing me where they're kept?" He led her to a narrow storeroom off the side aisle where old music stands and dust-covered banners had been stacked like relics. In one corner, a wooden trunk bore the brass plate M. Ashcroft, 1945. With Mr. Aberley's help, Miss Marple opened it. Inside were rolled maps, correspondence from the Ministry of Works, and a bundle of linen swatches. Not cloth for vestments, but small textile panels, each bearing stitched symbols, barely visible against the natural fabric. One panel featured a red triangle with a black border, another bore the robin's tail, just as Lavinia had stitched. A third had a small star, stitched in gold, with initials below it. Miss Marple lifted it gently. "For L.C. If found, bury the past." She stood still for a long moment. Lavinia Croft had not simply remembered a code. She had been part of it, not merely a passive embroiderer, but someone who had received a personal message decades ago. And perhaps she had forgotten it in youth, or had been told to forget it, but with age and repetition it had resurfaced. She'd remembered, and she had begun to act. The robin, the map, the donations. She wasn't just playing at symbolism. She was unearthing something someone believed safely buried. Rosemary Fell had tried to stop her, but she hadn't been the only one watching. Miss Marple returned to her cottage with the swatches, the ledger copy, and the knowledge that this mystery had always been bigger than murder. It was about memory, secrecy, and the dangerous act of telling the truth long after the world had moved on. By late afternoon, a soft knock sounded on her door. It was Inspector Graves, hat in hand, his brow furrowed. She confessed, he said. Rosemary claimed full responsibility, said she acted alone and that the map frightened her. We've charged her accordingly. Miss Marple nodded. I imagine it frightened her. But you're not satisfied. She looked at him carefully. She confessed to the murder, Miss Marple said, but she didn't frame the map. Graves tilted his head. Meaning? Meaning, she replied. Rosemary didn't add the message. She simply recognized it. Someone else, perhaps decades ago, left that map with Lavinia, or rather, left its contents to be found by her when the time was right. Who? I don't yet know, said Miss Marple, but the embroidery was never just art, it was always a message. She offered him the panel with the gold star and initials. Graves took it, frowning. Do we know who L.C. was? Miss Marple gave him a sad smile. I believe we do now. The following day brought a strange hush over Tanswood Green. Though the village had endured funerals before, and certainly its share of scandal, there was something different now. It wasn't just that Rosemary Fell had been charged, or that Lavinia Croft had died in her armchair so unexpectedly. It was the sense, quiet and creeping, that there were still pieces missing. As if the pattern everyone thought was complete had in truth been embroidered around a hole. Miss Marple, as always, took her morning tea at the garden table, draped in a pale shawl against the late autumn breeze. The warmth of the cup in her hands offered little comfort. Her thoughts were not with the dead now, but with the story still hidden among the living. There was something peculiar about the coated fabric square she had found in Ashcroft's trunk. The initials L.C. clearly pointed to Lavinia Croft, and yet Lavinia herself had once said, rather charmingly, that she had never been one for secrets, only fine stitches. Miss Marple thought again about the timeline. Lavinia had received that panel in 1948, just after Ashcroft's death. She would have been in her late 20s then, newly retired from teaching due to what she'd once described as a general distaste for children's shouting. A solitary woman, yes, but one with sharp faculties and a cleaner conscience than most. So why would someone have written her that cryptic message, if found, bury the past? It sounded less like a warning and more like a pact, a shared secret between two people who had known the same truth and had perhaps tried to forget it. Miss Marple reached for the letter she had retrieved from Lavinia's bureau days earlier, the one left unsigned with the ominous sentence, "You shouldn't have," stitched what wasn't meant to be seen. She had almost believed Rosemary had sent it. Almost. But Rosemary had admitted to nothing of the sort, which meant another person, perhaps one who had seen the framed map before it went missing, had discovered what Lavinia had included. Or worse, what she had intended to reveal. Later that morning, Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard, not to pay respects, but to visit the gravestone of Maurice Ashcroft, the man whose posthumous trunk had unravelled so much of the village's quiet. The path was lined with wet leaves, trodden into the soil by recent rains. The church bell rang, once as she passed beneath the stone archway. There, beneath a yew tree twisted by age, stood Ashcroft's gravestone. It was simple, just his name, his birth and death year, and the brief line, "A builder of peace." Miss Marple took a moment to consider those words. Peace, she thought, often comes with a cost, and some costs, if not paid openly, are passed on to those least prepared for them. Miss Marple. The voice behind her belonged to the vicar, Reverend Hughes, soft-voiced and tall, his dark coat buttoned all the way up despite the mild chill. "Forgive me," he said as he stepped beside her. "I saw you from the study window." "Not at all," she replied. "I find old stones comforting." "Some do," he said. "Though the parishioners have been less comforted lately, they speak as though the village itself has lost its sense of sanctuary." Miss Marple looked at him. "It may be," she said gently, "that the village has remembered something it once buried, and that, my dear vicar, can be more disturbing than any stranger's crime." He frowned faintly. "Is there something I can help you understand?" "I believe so," she said, turning from the gravestone. "I wanted to ask you about Lavinia Croft. More precisely, her involvement with your parish beyond the donations and embroidery. Did she ever assist in matters of administration?" He considered. "In the early 50s, yes. She helped catalogue post-war records, parish deeds, property donations, and the like. Why? Did she ever mention a land parcel near the east side of the churchyard wall?" The vicar raised an eyebrow. "That's where the orchard once stood. It was cleared after the war. That section now lies unused beyond the hedge." "Unused," repeated Miss Marple. "Yes." "Why?" "Because," said Miss Marple, "that's where the sundial used to stand." He paused, remembering. "My word, you're right. It was moved in the 60s to the front green. But originally, yes, it was in the orchard." Miss Marple smiled faintly. 2 feet from the sundial," she murmured. The vicar blinked. "I'm sorry." "An instruction left by Ashcroft in the ledger. He believed something was buried there, something Lavinia either found or feared she might." By midday, a discreet call was placed to Inspector Graves. He arrived in a rain-spotted motor car, expression weary but respectful. He had grown to trust Miss Marple's instincts, even if they cost him sleep and explanations to superiors. Under his direction, and with Reverend Hughes present to bless the ground, a small section of earth was dug behind the churchyard wall, just where the sundial once stood. It did not take long. 3 feet down, a tin container emerged from the soil. It was rusted and sealed with wax, stamped with a faint ministry emblem. Inside were papers, deeds, letters, and 2 black-and-white photographs. One of them showed a young Lavinia Croft standing beside Maurice Ashcroft, both smiling, both holding a cloth banner with embroidered markings, markings identical to the panel Miss Marple had found in the trunk. The other photograph was of a different man, short, balding, with sharp features and a smirk that belonged more to theatre than diplomacy. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "C. Rowntree, traitor, vanished 1945. Proof enclosed." Graves stared. This is intelligence. Material." Miss Marple nodded. "More than that, Inspector, it's the key to why Lavinia was killed. She had found the box. or rather remembered where it was buried. She intended to give it to the vicar. She wanted it to be handled with truth and decency. Graves exhaled slowly. Rowntree, he said. That name surfaced in a ministry leak years ago. Suspected of handing over British blueprints to Soviet agents. Disappeared before he could be questioned. And, Miss Marple said gently, I believe someone in this village knew where he'd been. Perhaps even helped bury the record. Graves looked at her sharply. You're saying Rowntree came here? I'm saying, she replied, that secrets don't always travel far. Sometimes they retire to parishes and become respected members of society. Graves looked again at the photograph. His jaw tightened. We'll check every face, every file. Miss Marple turned toward the orchard. I believe Lavinia did not intend to expose anyone, she said. She simply felt that the time had come to stop carrying someone else's burden, and she paid for that with her life. There was a long silence, then the inspector said, And Rosemary? Miss Marple sighed. She acted in fear, yes, but not in cold blood. The real killer is still here, watching. Graves narrowed his eyes. Do you have a name? Miss Marple nodded once. But I shall need one more conversation before I'm sure. It was a clear, quiet evening in Tanswood Green when Miss Marple arranged for tea at the vicarage. The request was delivered with perfect courtesy and with no air of suspicion, only the kind of polite suggestion a gentlewoman makes when she has one more thing on her mind and the daylight is beginning to fade. The invitation was addressed to Mr. Leonard Weybridge, the former chairman of the Parish Lands Committee, a widower of 67 years with carefully oiled hair and a reputation for probity. He arrived punctually at 5, his hat tucked under one arm, his shoes buffed to an exacting shine. He was known for such details. He valued order, control, and the kind of quiet that comes from being above suspicion. Miss Marple welcomed him with a warm smile. I do hope you'll forgive the informality, Mr. Weybridge. I thought a little. Comfort would do us both some good after the recent shocks. Quite right, he said, lowering himself into the chair by the hearth. Ghastly business with Miss Croft. And now the revelations about old Ashcroft's records. It's a wonder the church hasn't crumbled from the weight of it all. She poured tea into delicate porcelain cups, blue-rimmed with a faded thistle pattern. One wonders, doesn't one, she said gently, how many secrets lie beneath our feet. Though it seems Lavinia Croft remembered rather more than she was supposed to. Weybridge gave a thin smile. Yes, well, she always did have a nose for mischief, Lavinia. Couldn't leave things buried. Miss Marple looked at him over her spectacles. Indeed. And I suppose she had quite the motivation for digging up the past, when she realized she had been entrusted with more than just a bit of decorative embroidery. He stiffened almost imperceptibly. Entrusted. She was sent a message, you. See? Miss Marple went on, lifting her teaspoon delicately. A stitched message from Maurice Ashcroft, a reminder, really, that something had been left in her care and that it would need to be seen by the right person when the time came. Weybridge took a careful sip of his tea, eyes steady. Do go on, Miss Marple. This is all fascinating. I hadn't thought embroidery to be so seditious. Oh, it can be, she said lightly. One need only consider how many secrets were hidden in patterns during the war, Morse code in knitting, signals in thread counts. But this was more personal. Lavinia's panel was marked with a gold star and her initials along with a message. If found, bury the past. Rather curious, don't you think? His smile faded slightly. I suppose some people thought it romantic, others inconvenient. Quite so, she said. And it would have remained merely curious had Lavinia not decided to reveal it. She wished to give the map to Reverend Hughes, but it never reached him. A pause. The fire crackled softly. "You're implying something, Miss Marple," Weybridge said at last, "and I do hope you'll be good enough to be plain with me." "Of course," she said kindly. "I believe, Mr. Weybridge, that you were involved with Mr. Ashcroft in more than just civic reconstruction, that during the war you acted as a middleman of sorts, relaying property, people, and information, and that, when Rowntree fled, you helped hide his identity, perhaps even advised him to seek shelter here in Tanswood Green." Weybridge's hand twitched. "Just slightly. That's absurd," she nodded. "Yes, I imagine it sounds that way, until one remembers that Rowntree vanished in 1945, that the very next spring a quiet and respectable gentleman named Geoffrey Langham, your cousin by marriage, suddenly took up residence at the house on Fernside Lane, claiming to be a retired clerk, a man who kept to himself, who never travelled, who avoided all photographs." Weybridge did not respond. Miss Marple continued, voice still soft, "And that when Maurice Ashcroft died in 1948, Lavinia Croft received an embroidered panel that no one else was meant to see. You must have hoped she had forgotten it, or dismissed it as a sentimental relic. But time has a strange way of stitching memory back together. Lavinia began to ask questions, and you began to worry." "I had nothing to do with her death," Weybridge said, his voice sharp. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Nor do I believe you killed her with your own hands, but I do believe that you warned Rosemary Fell, that you told her what Lavinia had found, that she would hand it to the vicar, that it would ruin your legacy and perhaps uncover Langham's secret past. She was going to destroy everything," Weybridge said suddenly. "All of it. The trust we had built, the charity, the quiet this village has enjoyed for decades." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Truth is rarely destructive in itself," she said, "but the fear of it can lead people to do very dangerous things." He rose from his chair, shaking slightly. "Do you intend to turn me in, Miss Marple?" She studied him a long moment. "No, not unless the police ask me directly. You see, Mr. Weybridge, you are not a murderer. You are merely a man who has grown, so used to lies that he no longer knows how much damage silence can cause. That, in my opinion, is punishment enough." His shoulders slumped. He looked older than before. As he left the vicarage, Miss Marple remained at the window, watching him walk down the lane, past the hedges and rose trellises, into the dimming light. That night, she made one final note in her little brown notebook. Motivation. Fear of exposure. Weybridge informed Rosemary, indirectly complicit. Real killer, Rosemary. True culprit. A village culture that reveres silence over truth. By morning, Inspector Graves had arrived again. She told him what he needed to know, gently, but without flinching. Rosemary Fell would still face justice. But now the story of Lavinia Croft would be told in full. In the days that followed, the embroidered map was framed and hung in the parish hall, not as a symbol of heritage, but as a record of courage. The hidden robin, the gold thread, the quiet stitches all bore witness to one woman's choice to remember. Tanswood Green would not forget again. A week after the truth was finally spoken aloud in Tanswood Green, the first real rain of autumn came. Not a thunderous storm, but a soft, soaking kind that drummed against the cottage roofs and turned the narrow lanes into winding ribbons of silver. The village returned to a kind of normalcy, though not the one it had known before the death of Miss Lavinia Croft. At the church, the embroidered map was mounted at last, framed in walnut and set upon a linen backing. It hung with an unassuming grace near the vestry, across from the parish register. Curious villagers came and stood before it in silence, their eyes following the golden threads from cottage to lane, and pausing at the tiny robin stitched just beside the east gate. No plaque accompanied it, no legend, no explanation. But those who looked long enough seemed to come away with something more than aesthetic admiration. There was a quiet acknowledgment, a recognition that sometimes truth is preserved not in ledgers or courtrooms, but in the quiet labor of hands guided by memory. Miss Marple, for her part, had returned to her peaceful rituals. Her garden required pruning before the frost, and she had taken to wearing her blue cardigan again, the one with the single missing button at the cuff. Her mornings passed in soft silence, her evenings with a novel or needlework by the lamp. On a Thursday afternoon, just as the clouds began to lift and the finches returned to the trees, she received a visitor. It was Inspector Graves. He arrived. Without fanfare, his car parked slightly askew by the front gate. He wore his raincoat still buttoned, and his expression, though sober, had lost the edge of doubt that had once hovered around him. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," he said as she opened the door. "Not at all, Inspector. Do come in. I've just made a fresh pot of lapsang souchong." He followed her into the sitting-room and took the chair she indicated near the fire. It was the same chair Weybridge had used just days before. "I've come to thank you," Graves said simply, once the tea was poured. Miss Marple nodded. "That's kind, though I rather think it was Lavinia Croft who did most of the work." Graves sighed. "A brave woman, and clever." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, stirring her tea, "but brave in the quiet way, the sort of courage that doesn't shout or demand, but acts from conscience." He hesitated. "I've just come from Rosemary Fell." Miss Marple looked up, though her expression did not change. "She confessed?" she asked gently. Graves nodded. "It wasn't cold-blooded, but it was deliberate. She said she only meant to frighten Lavinia, meant to retrieve the map and the letter before it reached the vicar. But something went wrong. She claimed Lavinia had begun to realize who she was dealing with. There was a confrontation, panic, a cup of tea laced with something stronger. Digitalis, likely from her own garden. Miss Marple let out a slow breath. And yet it was Mr. Weybridge who planted the seed in her mind. "Yes," said Graves, "enough that it may warrant a charge, though whether the Crown will pursue it remains to be seen." "Fear," Miss Marple murmured. "So often at the root of things, not malice, not greed, just fear of exposure, of consequence." Graves looked down at his hands. "I wonder sometimes if villages aren't more dangerous than cities," he said. "People in towns may hide in crowds, but in villages the walls themselves remember things." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Yes, but they also forgive. With time." There was a comfortable pause, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Graves set down his cup. "One thing still troubles me," he said. "Rowntree. The man Langham was before. He lived here nearly 20 years, quietly, without incident. If the documents Lavinia found had been discovered in his lifetime, would anyone have believed them? Miss Marple looked at him with a thoughtful expression. No one ever knows the full shape of a man's life, Inspector. We only know the part he lives among us. What he did before, what he ran from, may have been terrible. But he lived his final years as a friend to his neighbours, a donor to the school, and a gardener who grew the finest delphiniums in the county. Are you saying that forgives him? No, she said softly. But it complicates judgment. We must be truthful, yes, but we must also remember that even in guilt there can be change. Lavinia understood that. She didn't want revenge, she wanted the truth to be safe, to be seen. Graves stood, nodded, and tipped his hat before leaving. Miss Marple watched him go from the window, the afternoon light slanting through the clouds, and falling in pale stripes across the garden. As evening approached, Miss Marple took a walk through the village. She passed the grocer's, where Mrs. Armitage was arguing about the quality of plums. She passed the green, where schoolchildren shouted and chased a ball with the heedless joy of youth. She even passed Fernside Lane, where the house once belonging to Mr. Langham now stood dark, its curtains drawn, its future uncertain. At the church she paused. The map was still there, framed, pristine, yet alive with meaning. She looked again at the tiny robin, so easily overlooked, yet the key to it all. A detail small enough to be missed, but too personal to be meaningless. In that bird, Lavinia Croft had spoken the truth, not in accusation, but in remembrance, and in doing so had restored more than justice, she had restored the village's memory of itself. Miss Marple turned and began her walk home. The air had turned crisp, and smoke from nearby chimneys rose in gentle spirals above the rooftops. Somewhere in the distance the vicar's bell chimed a single measured note. Later, back at her cottage, she returned to her embroidery. Her fingers, though not as nimble as they once were, moved with practiced calm. She was stitching a border of oak leaves, green and gold, into a square of cream fabric. She had not yet decided what the centre should hold. Perhaps a tree, perhaps a robin, or perhaps simply initials. L.C.